I owned an RV that I would use all the time as a camper in the woods behind my house site was a piece of junk, but I would only drive it out a couple miles then park it and hang out for a few days, so it didn't need to be anything special. Around 4 years ago, I took this RV out into the woods for a normal weekend of camping. I drove out on the dirt road about a mile, then pulled off into a small plot in between all the trees and set up campy. Made a small fire and brought out chairs, then sat back and had some drinks. I'd take friends out with me a lot, but they weren't always able to spend several days away, so this was just some time I was spending with myself. As nights started coming in, I put some more fuel in the fire pit. Just after the sun had fully gone down, I heard something moving around outside my camp. It didn't sound like any wildlife, it sounded more like a person walking somewhere out in the trees. I looked out in that direction but didn't see anything. This went on for around 20 minutes, hearing what sounded like someone walking around my camp. I put out the fire and went inside the RV, locking it up for the night and checking out the windows over the next hour, but still never seeing anything. From all the times I'd come out into the woods, I'd never once had someone come across my camp, so this was not a normal occurrence. Also, knowing that they were wandering in the dark without a flashlight was even less normal. I double-checked the locks before going to bed, and thankfully I got a good night's sleep. In the morning, I got up and made coffee, ate breakfast, and spent a couple hours in the RV before going outside. I wanted to take a hike around, but it wasn't too comfortable with leaving my RV there knowing that someone else was out here, so instead I went for a short walk. I went out where I had heard the person from last night, looking for any shoe prints to confirm that it was actually a person, but from my quick search I didn't find anything helpful. I don't know if it made me more or less uneasy, but when I got back to the RV, I brought out my handgun and strapped it to my waist just to be safe. When it was night again, I started up the fire pit and tried to take my mind off of things. I sat outside for a while, I want to say probably an hour, and was relieved to have not hurt anyone. I had a beer and listened to the calming sounds of the woods at night until I got sleepy. I stood up and went to put out the fire when I saw a figure in the corner of my head. Quickly shifted to look at them. They were standing between the trees, maybe 25 feet away, blowing in the faint light of the fire pit and just watching me. Only a moment passed before they turned and walked away, leaving the light. I was really creeped out, and not hearing any more footsteps or movement only made me more paranoid about where they could be. Picked up everything I had outside and put it in the RV, then put out the fire and locked myself inside again. I was even thinking about fully packing up and heading home in the morning, because this just wasn't going to be a nice time anymore. Whoever was out there had now come by my RV twice, and neither time did they say anything or introduce themselves. I stayed on watch for a couple hours, checking the windows multiple times and listening intently. It was during the third hour, while I was nodding off in my chair, that I heard footsteps approaching the RV. They were walking quickly, going right up to the door. I stayed quiet, clutching my pistol and hoping for them not to do anything. There were a few odd seconds of them not making a sound, but just standing on the other side of the door, and they slowly walked around the RV, then quickly ran away. I stayed awake until the sun came up, and as soon as it was clear enough to drive, I got the RV ready and drove home. Whoever was out there had to have some sick plans for them to be coming up to my RV like that in the middle of the night, and I knew that if I stayed it would likely have ended up really bad for one of us, and I wasn't going to take me chances for it to be me. I'm a 24-year-old female from northern Arizona. This was a couple years ago. At the time, I was living out of a small camper van traveling along the West Coast. There is a lot of different lifestyles. People like to live in these types of vans or RVs. I always tried to keep out of the big cities and stick to small towns for camping in between destinations, but for the most part, I like to camp out in the backcountry. Being in the middle of the woods with nobody else around was where I found myself most comfortable and where I most enjoyed the lifestyle of traveling. I think part of it is that it was always safer to be out by yourself in the forest than it was to be stealth camping in a busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, it can still get creepy at night, but I always know I am better off out there with nobody around. This week, I was slowly traveling between two big cities in Washington. I was taking my time, staying on the back roads and hunkering down at campsites for several days at a time. On this day, I pulled off the road and onto a small dirt trail going deep into the forest. There were a few pull-off spots, but none were taken, and it looked like nobody had been down here in a while. So I kept going, hoping to secure a larger and more scenic spot. At the end, There was a large circle to pull off on. It wasn't scenic, just surrounded by trees, but it was large and secluded and peaceful, and even had a stone circle in the middle for a campfire. I leveled out my van and parked. Since it was the middle of spring, it was raining pretty much every day here in Washington, so there wasn't much for me to do outside. I opened the side door to my van for some fresh air while I cooked a meal on my propane stove. It was around sunset, so I still had several hours before I'd be in bed. Over the next 30 minutes, the sun fell past the horizon and the rain started picking up. I shut the door to keep the water out and instead cracked open one of the small windows near the back of the van. I sat on the bed and watched a show on my laptop. But midway through it, a glare came in from the open window behind me. It was a light reflecting onto the screen of my laptop. Before I was able to react, it went away. It didn't move away, though. It turned off as if someone switched the light off. When I turned around and looked out the window, I saw nothing. It was really dark and still pouring down outside. I had no way to know how far the light came from or what it even was. Being on a trail with other pull-off spots, I had to assume it was just another camper. Maybe their headlights that somehow found its way through the trees and shined into my window. Then they quickly turned their vehicle off. The only problem with that was the light didn't come from the road I came down. Behind my window was just trees. Maybe there was another trail I didn't know about. There wasn't much investigating I could do anyway, so I turned back around and went back on my laptop. Occasionally, I'd check out the windows or think I'd heard something outside. But with the rain clanking against the metal roof, it wasn't clear if I was actually hearing something or not. Every time I looked, though, I never saw anything to confirm that something was out there, so I didn't worry myself too much. I want to say it was about 10 or 11 when I decided to call it in for the night and try to sleep. I turned off everything in the van, closed all the windows, and drew the shades. It was nearly pitch black inside. I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Usually, I didn't have much trouble at all, but tonight I just couldn't manage to fall asleep. Unfortunately, the rain picked up even more after an hour and thunder started rolling in. It was very loud and made it impossible to even try to sleep. About 2 hours into the night, and through all the harsh rain and thunder, I swear I heard something move outside. It was just loud enough for me to know IRL I heard something. It sounded like someone or something running and kicking over a branch on the ground somewhere just outside of my van. As soon as I heard it, there were no other sounds. It was so dark I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. The longer I looked out there, the more uneasy I felt. I just had this feeling like someone else was looking back at me. I put the window cover back down. I sat there and tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but only a minute later, I heard a voice. It was a male voice, kinned off in a loud whisper, like they were talking to someone else. I sat in silence, too scared to open the covers and look out the windows again, knowing they'd probably see me if they hadn't already. However, they likely already could assume someone was in the van, which makes it all the more terrifying. There was a good 2 or 3 minutes where I didn't hear anything aside from the rain and thunder before there was suddenly something outside the sliding side door to the van. It sounded like bending plastic, like someone was leaning against the side door. Then there was a knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. Even though I was sure they knew I was in here already, I still was too scared to speak. Maybe they weren't sure how many people were inside or if I was a man or a woman. So, I felt safer not giving them anything and just staying quiet. A very disturbing and anxious 5 minutes went by as the knocking continued every few seconds without anyone saying anything. They had to be drenched by now and probably couldn't see at all through this weather. But then they finally said something. Sheriff's Department, open up. What? I didn't believe that for a second. If it were true, why wouldn't they have said that from the beginning? They continued knocking and calling out different lines, all basically stating that they were an officer and I needed to open the door. This seemed like a desperate attempt to get me to open up without violence. I slowly lifted the window cover and looked out. All I could see was a dark figure moving near the door, but from the shape of it, it didn't look like he had any sort of law enforcement gear on, so I was sure this was about to get really bad. I debated in my head what to do for 30 seconds as it felt like the knocking got more and more impatient before I decided to risk getting into the driver's seat and trying to drive away. As soon as I went up there and turned the car on, I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up to the side of the van. I began pulling out just as a figure appeared in the window next to me. Thank God the van didn't get stuck and I was able to get out onto the trail. As I drove away, I never saw any other vehicle down the road, which makes the intentions of these unknown people likely really disturbing. I put in our report with the county, who of course said no officers were out there that night, but I never got any follow-up. Things could have gotten really bad out there, but I haven't had anything else happen since then. My family owns some cabins in Oregon that all of us like to stay in sometimes or have family get-togethers there, but for this trip I was going solo. I just turned 20 and I'd never been camping alone, and I figured camping somewhere near the cabins would be perfect in case something were to happen. I drove an hour there, then walked 30 minutes down a trail that led to the cabin I would be staying by. As I walked up to it, I noticed one of the windows was missing. There was no glass on the ground. It looked like the entire window had just been taken out, which was a very unexpected thing to see. I didn't plan on entering the cabin. Booty had brought the key for emergencies, and this felt like something I should investigate, but I was even more confused. When the door opened without me unlocking it, I walked in, and right away it was obvious that the place had been broken into. There were muddy footprints all over the floors, and some more expensive stuff was missing. It was unfortunate to see, but there was no way of knowing how long ago it all happened. From what I knew, it had been months since anyone was at the cabins, and even then they may not have even come to this cabin. I tried to lock up the place as best I could and set out to find a spot to camp. I had no service, but I didn't feel it was absolutely necessary to let my family know right away or even to call the police. Yeti walked 30 minutes down the hill from the cabin and found the flat enough spot to set up. Rain started pouring down, and being new to this, it took me a couple hours to get everything set up the right way. Already being soaked, I sat outside on a nearby log under a tree and started eating some prepackaged food when out of nowhere I started hearing someone talking. I immediately spotted a man walking behind me. He was drenched, walking up the hill toward the direction of the cabin, and didn't seem to have noticed me. The way he was speaking was really weird because it made no sense, and he was obviously talking to himself. Soon he walked out of sight, but something about seeing that gave me chills. An hour went by and I took a quick hike back up to the cabin to see if he was maybe staying there, but from afar it still looked empty, so I went back. Once it was night, I used a fire kit to start a small campfire and used it to heat up some of my food. The rain made it difficult, but once the fire was going it stayed out pretty well. Not long into it, I heard footsteps coming from up the hill. I stared at the trees, seeing nothing but pitch black. Beyond the reach of my campfire, they continued walking until a man came into sight. I couldn't see much of him, but he looked similar to the man I'd seen earlier. "Hey, what do you want?" I yelled, trying to scare him off. Stopped and stared at me with a blank face, having rain dripping from his heatos. He just stood there. I yelled again, but he didn't move. "You were standing just 10 feet from each other," and every second made me more and more scared of what was about to happen. Then through the rain, I heard the sound of a single footstep behind me. Instantly sprinted to the side of the hill and didn't stop until my legs gave out under me. I don't think they chased me, but with the rain and wind it was too hard for me to hear. While running, I found my way up the hill and walked the rest of the way to my car in the rain with only my phone light. Once I got in range, I called 911. In the days following, a team was sent out to investigate the cabin, and my campsite was gone, left with only a few useless pieces of equipment. But in the cabin they identified 3 unique shoe prints on the floor. It had me shaking for weeks, knowing that there were 3 unknown men out there hiding not far away. Nothing else was found, and it was all said to most likely just be a robbery because they didn't chase me, but who knows what they would have done to me if I had stayed there. Every year as a kid, my family would go on these big camping trips. I was always really excited because we lived in Arizona where there's pretty much nothing, and we'd camp in Washington. Seeing trees and grass was my favorite part, but I also got to see all my cousins, and even though we only saw each other a couple times a year, we were really close. My favorite cousin, who was more like a brother to me, was Luis. He was a year older than me, and we were inseparable when together because of what happened. We became even closer after that camping trippy. Think it took us both a while to understand what really went on and what more could have happened to us. Music. It started when we had been there for 2 days already. Most of our family was either in the lake or by the campfire talking. Luis didn't like to swim, so we decided to play in the woods. Instead, we played a version of tag called Bandit. We'd switch off being the cop and chase the other one who was the bandit until we catch them. We would play for hours. But in the woods, it's easy to just keep running and not know where you're going. We tried our best to stay within viewing distance, but when Luis started chasing with a huge stick, I guess my adrenaline kicked in the hyperspeed. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I ended up at an old-looking trailer. Luis wasn't far behind, but I remember him throwing the stick down. His focus now on what we both assumed was an abandoned trailer. We discussed investigating it further, and I'm not really sure why, but we decided not to. Started walking back, but we didn't really know where we were going. Probably about 10 minutes into our walk, we saw a couple coming towards us pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. The woman approaches us and is really nice. While the man stayed back, she asked if we were lost, who we were, with our names and ages, and I remember when we told her how old we were, she looked back at the guy and then to us again. She told us we don't have to be scared, then she'll help us find our way home after they drop off their stuff at their campsite. She said we could also make s'mores if we wanted. Luis and I were hesitant, but she seemed really nice, and it was still daytime, so for some reason that made everything way less suspicious. In my 7-year-old brain, bad people only do things at night, so we were walked with them for a while, following them back to their camp while her and Luis were talking. I glanced over at the shopping cart. It was filled with a bunch of rusty metal things in what looked like to be nothing new. Nothing was in bags, everything just looked like trash they'd found somewhere. I started to get really uncomfortable, and I could tell Luis was too. Every time I'd look over at the guy, he was never smiling, and sometimes he'd be staring at me with a blank stare. This was 18 years ago, and I still remember how creepy he looked. Walked a bit further until the trailer came back into view, and the woman grabbed mine's hands and asked if we were excited for s'mores. Suddenly I heard Luis's name being called, and then mine. We all stopped for a second, and the lady squeezed my hand a bit tighter. She asked something to the guy along the lines of what they should do. Responded, but I don't remember what he said. The lady started to turn us toward the trailer while holding us tighter and tighter. She started to speed up as well into sort of a fast walk. I looked back and saw my sister through the trees. Without hesitation, I yelled her name, and the lady immediately let go of my hand. Luis and I ran to her as she made her way towards us. My sister yelled to the others. Thatched found us. My mom and dad thanked the couple who had told them this elaborate story on how they've been trying to find our parents for a while now, and that we're such sweet boys and everything. I remember my parents inviting the couple over for burgers, but thankfully they declined. I think because the lady was so nice and that we were found safe that my parents didn't think twice. I do recall my dad and uncle talking about how creepy the guy was. Thuff me cousin, and I ended up telling my sister who found us that the couple was weird, but I don't think she understood what we meant. It wasn't until my cousin and I were old enough to understand that some people have really bad intentions. We talked about it again in depth, and we both came to the conclusion that by the looks of it, they were tight on money and were probably going to sell us or something. For years growing up, I had kept this from my parents because I was supposed to be the strong man of the family, and thinking about that time made me feel gross and preyed upon. Luis also felt embarrassed as he was older than me and felt he had failed to protect me. We eventually told our parents a few years ago, but I wish we had told them immediately, and maybe something could have been done. Nowadays, I never let my kids out of my sight and always let them know that they can tell me anything without fear of being judged, especially my son. Last year, I went out on my own into the forest about an hour from my house to go camping for a night. I wasn't planning anything special. I just wanted to spend some time outside for a day and then go home, and although inexperienced, I didn't see the harm in being out for just a day. When I got to the camping trail, there were 3 cars parked on the road right next to it. I really didn't want to talk to anyone or spend the day around other people, so I kept driving until I found a different trail down the road. There were no places to park, so I had to go further down and then walk back. This trail was very thin and was all dirt, no gravel or anything, so it definitely wasn't a popular spot. I started down it, going through relatively flat terrain with nothing but trees and bushes around us. I got about 2 hours in. The trail slowly started thinning out until it was getting difficult to even tell if I was still on it or not. I had a feeling this could happen at the beginning, but I was 2 hours in, so I Wasn't even worried about it by then and had completely overlooked it. I turned around and started to make my way back, trying my best to find the more defined portion of the path, but just 5 minutes later I saw something that made me stop in my Placia cabin sitting right in the middle of the forest. My first thought on seeing it was that EWAS 100 lost because I hadn't seen it on the way up, but then my thoughts shifted toward the eerie feeling it was giving me. What was a cabin doing way out here? I approached it slowly, and seeing as it had no door, I looked inside. It was a mess full of old garbage. The longer I stayed, though, the more creeped out I got. I turned around and started going back to the trail, but was interrupted by a loud thump from behind me. I looked back at the cabin, and through the doorway I saw a man appear from behind the wall. He was middle-aged and wearing torn-up clothes, pretty much looking like he lived there. He looked at me with a creepy, emotionless face. I nervously said sorry, then quickly walked away. I looked back once, seeing him staring at me as I got further away. I spent the next hour on edge, looking everywhere for the trail, while also making sure I wasn't being followed. As the sun began to set, I got increasingly more worried, but thankfully just before the light was gone I found the middle of the trail. I debated just going back to my car, but chose to stake out the night just to be sure I didn't lose my way again. I unloaded my bag and got my tent set up, then went inside and laid down. I had planned to get a fire going and do a bunch of other stuff, but at this point I wasn't even in the mood anymore and just wanted to rest. I closed my eyes and drifted into sleep. When my eyes opened, it was pitch black, and all I heard was the forest creaking. Tilt in my head, and my eyes locked on the entrance to my tent. Staring back at me was the shadow-covered face of the man with his head sticking through the half-opened entryway. I jumped back, and the man did the same. I heard his footsteps hurrying away as I got out and looked, only seeing the back of him running into the woods. With my heart still racing, I undid everything and shoved it into my bag, then carefully followed the trail all the way back to my carry. Can't even begin to think of what that man was about to do while I was sleeping, but his eyes looking back at me through the dark was a horrifying sight that is yet to leave my head. I, of course, never went back and have mostly refrained from talking about it just because I know I won't ever get any answers. I was taking a summer hiking and camping vacation a year ago to a small river near my parents' house. I was visiting them for a few days, then going out alone to camp along the river for a night or two and head back home afterward. I don't live in the most adventurous state, so I always try to get out in nature whenever I'm in my parents' town. After visiting them, I set out on my hike. The trail I took to get to the river was around 4 hours at a steady walking pace, but the best part about it was that nobody else ever used it. The river wasn't huge or anything, and there were plenty of trails that were more scenic and actually labeled. This one was just some thin dirt path that wasn't very defined. When I got to the river, it was basically dark, so I pitched my tent and got a fire going so I could relax before bed. As I sat there for a few minutes, I started hearing footsteps coming toward me. Looked over, and after a minute a man appeared from the trees. He waved at me and came over to my campsite. With a smile, he looks like a normal man in his early 30s, though a bit dirty and unkempt, like he'd been camping out here for a while. After introducing himself as John, had a small talk with me, telling me that he was camping not far from here. I went along with the talking just to not be rude, but the whole thing felt off. Eventually, the man said goodnight and walked away. I watched as he went along the river with his flashlight, but after a minute the light shut off and there was nothing else after that. I didn't think that much of the encounter initially, but the man definitely had something off about him. What worried me the most was how he had come up just a few minutes after I got the fire going. He had to have been really close by, like he was following me or something. I chalked it all up to my nerves and told myself it was just dumb luck that he was out here after all. He came up and introduced himself, which I assumed he wouldn't have done if he had any bad intentions. I smothered the fire and stayed up and lightened for a while, then fell asleep. I woke up at sunrise and spent the day hiking along the river. Strangely, I never saw any other campsites, though no signs of fire or tents being set up, not even in the direction I'd seen the man walk in. I figured he must have been further into the forest, but it only made me slightly more nervous. I got back to my tent just before dark and was surprised to see John sitting next to my unlit campfire. "Can I help you?" I said. He smiled and said he was waiting for me to come back because he had found something down the river. He got up and started walking, urging me to come with him and see for myself. I hesitated. "I'm gonna stay here, John. I'm just a bit tired." He turned around and looked at me with that same smile and asked me again to go with him. We looked each other in the eyes for a long couple seconds, and I knew for sure that something wasn't right. His smile began to fade, and he asked me one more time in a less friendly tone. I chose to not say anything, and After a moment, he turned around and started walking toward the river. As I watched him, I saw the outline of Asmal gun poking out of his shirt like he had shoved it in the back of his pants. While not uncommon to bring a firearm out in the forests, I'd never known any hiker or camper to have it uncomfortably in the back of their pants belt with their shirt on top of it. The only reason would be to have it concealed from other people's view, which as far as I know shouldn't be the main concern when going deep into a forest. After seeing that, I started getting everything together and was walking back within the hour. Thankfully, I was able to stay on the path in the dark and made it back to my car after 4.5 hours off walking. The more I think about it now, the more terrifying that encounter was. I am almost sure he had followed me to my campsite, but I don't know for how long or if he was stalking me the entire time I was there. Him trying to lure me out to the river was almost surely an attempt at something awful, and I think that if I hadn't left when I did, he probably would have come back later in the night and it never would have been seen again. Last year was the first time I'd ever had something happen on my camping trip. I'd go camping alone several times a year, usually going to the same spots, but sometimes I try and find somewhere different. For this trip, I decided on a 4-mile camping trail that I'd never been on before. I drove out 2 hours from my house to our remote location where I started the hike from. Right away, I was not enjoying the trail as much as I thought I would, mainly because some portions of it were wet and muddy. Still, I continued along and tried to avoid those spots. I went down for a while, and around 45 minutes in, I saw something off the side of the trail. It was a tent, but very worn down and had a few rips in it. From afar, I could see that nobody was inside of it, so I walked closer. There were no signs of any intentional damage at all, just seemed to be weathered over a long period of time. The fact that it was still standing up was mind-blowing to me. I looked around it and inside of it, but oddly enough, there was nothing else. I thought I'd find a bunch of stuff left behind, but there wasn't anything at all other than the tent itself. After a couple of minutes, I went back to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't come up with any good reasons to leave a tent like that. As I walked for the last hour and a half off the trail, I came across dozens of left behind objects. All of them were camping or hiking equipment, but seeing all of this stuff scattered around a 4-mile trail gave me an uneasy feeling. Who would leave everything behind? It was definitely not an accident, and I was pretty sure it was all from one person. When I got to the end, I set up my tent a good distance away from the trail just to be safe. It was getting dark already, so I stayed at my campsite until I was ready to sleep. I felt a bit nervous to go to bed, but I was able to sleep through the whole night without issue. When I got up, it was early in the morning, around 4 or 5, so the sun wasn't fully up yet. He unzipped my tent and stepped out, but right away I could tell something was wrong. I turned around, and on the other side of my tent a man stood just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, wearing disgusting clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. He looked at me with this empty stare. I stood there motionless. In the moment, I was so shocked and scared it almost didn't even seem real. Leave, he spoke in a soft yet creepy tone. I nodded and quickly started gathering my backpack, but he immediately rushed toward me. I fell back, and all I could get myself to say was okay, repeating it over and over. The man stood over me, still with that empty look in his eyes. Leave, he said again. I understood what he meant this time and quickly got up and rushed away, leaving everything behind. I took one look back as I got out off there, and the man was rummaging through my backpack like a curious animal. I jogged as far as I could, then fast walked the rest of the way to my car. Thank God I kept my phone and keys in my pocket, or this situation could have been 100 times worse. I drove out until I got service, then called 911. I found out that there was an almost identical case to what I experienced, but whoever filed it chose for it to not be publicly announced by the media. This was likely the person whose tent and belongings I found on the trail. After a week of talking to the police and going over everything, they were able to organize a small search party of officers. They went down the trail and came back with no sightings or evidence of the man, but they found most of my stuff nearby, my campsite, tossed around like trash. After that, the case went stale, just like the previous person's. The thing I always come back to is how the man didn't keep anything. He just scattered it all around the forest with no intent of using any of it. Me and one of my good friends, I'll call him Jesse, would go on camping trips once or twice a year. We used 2 more when we were roommates in college, but we both work full-time now. Jesse was the one who actually got me into camping, having done it his whole life. I hadn't even been camping once before I met him. This happened 2 years ago on one of our yearly camping trips that we went on in the summer. Specify we didn't go far out or anything. We basically went down a trail maybe 2 hours out, then set up our tents and everything. The whole point of it was to camp, not tow hike, and usually for around 4 to 5 days. When we got to a good spot, Jesse and I put everything together and relaxed. The next 3 days were just as you'd expect. We sat at the campfire and had some drinks and just talked. We went for some walks and played some board games as well, but to sum it all up, we really just relaxed. I mean, that was the whole point of it anyway. On the 4th day, we agreed to wrap it up and head back. The next morning sun was starting to set. We prepared to get the campfire going again. Jesse said he'd go for a short walk and collect some dry sticks, and he asked me to get the food out and prep it for cooking. I did as he said, but as the sun faded out, Jesse still wasn't back. It had been maybe 30 minutes, which wasn't a long time for a walk, but it was a long time to be collecting sticks. I figured he must have meant he was going for a walk just to walk and not necessarily for the sticks. I waited another 30 minutes. The sun was now fully set and it was getting really dark. I had turned on our heavy lamp for a light source, but I knew it would run out of batteries if I left it on too long. I was getting really worried about Jesse. He was the one who was experienced in everything, so it just didn't make sense for him to get lost like this. I figured it best to at least start the fire so that if he was lost, maybe he'd see the flame and find his way back. I took the lamp and collected a bundle of sticks and started the fire with some matches. By the 2-hour mark, I was really losing it. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to decide between looking for him or going back and calling for help or just staying put. Every scenario was running through my head. What if he gotten hurt and wasn't far away? Then looking for him would make sense, but if he was far away, then me getting lost would only burden everything more. 2 hours and 30 minutes after I'd last seen Jesse and 2 hours after nightfall, I heard a gunshot. It was far off, somewhat in the direction Jesse went in, but what really scared me about it was that neither of us had brought a gun. I stood up and paced around the campsite for a minute before grabbing the lamp and going out to try and find him. It didn't take long before I heard steady footsteps running toward me. My hand was trembling holding up the lamp, but the light only reached a few feet ahead. I saw a figure getting closer and I barely recognized them to be Jesse. His eyes were wide open and he looked horrified. I'd never seen anyone's expression but had visibly scared before. He told me in a sharp, hushed voice that we needed to leave right now. We ran back to the camp and got our backpacks but left the rest behind. I questioned him, but he refused to answer until we made it out of the woods. Said someone else was there and approached him on his walk. He held him at gunpoint, making him be quiet and follow them somewhere, for they reached wherever it was they were taking him. Jesse tried for his escape, and that's when I found him running. That's all he told me and ever has told me. Every time I ask, I can tell he's purposefully leaving out some important details, but he still refuses to share them. One he specifically leaves out is the gunshot. He never mentioned it personally. I know Jesse is a capable guy, and it wouldn't be far off to assume he tried to overpower the man holding him up. Maybe he got the gun away from him and did what he had to do to escape. It would explain Jesse's traumatized state and why the man didn't chase him. I don't know what happened back there, but ever since Jesse hasn't wanted to go camping again. Honestly, neither do I, but I just wish I could know the truth about what went down that night. I was on a camping trail in the northern Appalachians, I believe 5 years ago now. It wasn't anything special, just some new trail I was going along. I'd done many trails on this mountain range before and was confident in camping and hiking them. Based on my research beforehand, I planned to be on trail for 3 days camping. The 2 nights first portion was a decently beaten path, but the further out I got, the less apparent the path became. I continued still until a few things caught my attention and I started to wonder if I was even on the right path anymore. I checked my mapping compass as well as some directional notes I made on my phone when I was researching. After looking into it, I was 90% sure I was on a different path. However, the map showed no alternative paths on the route, so I was really unsure where I was. I turned around and followed the path back to try and get on the right trail again, but it was starting to get dark and I was worried that I'd venture off and get further lost, so I set up camp where I was. I didn't go through the effort of doing a full setup. I just put down my tent and that was about it. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and fell fast asleep. A few hours into the night, I woke up. To the best of my knowledge, it was for no other reason than having to use the bathroom, but when I unzipped the tent and went out to the trees, I noticed a glow in the distance, an unmistakable flickering glow of a campfire. My first thought was maybe someone had coincidentally followed the wrong path as well, but as I thought it over, I realized the chances of that were extremely low. It was also around 2 a.m., so having a fire going in the middle of the night like this was very unusual. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep knowing someone was nearby, and I wouldn't feel safe unless I knew that we're just fellow campers. My big idea was to start a fire of my own, hopefully showing them that I was nearby if they didn't already know, and if they were planning something, then it would show them that I was Awake and aware, I burned up a flame big enough for them to see, but only a minute or two later they put their fire out. Me face went numb. There was no way this was a coincidence too. I waited the night out, checking frequently for any sign of whoever was out there, but there was nothing else. In the morning I rolled up my tent and got my gear ready, but my curiosity got the best of me. If they were just campers, maybe they'd know the way back too. I had my handgun holstered to my chest just in case, and I approached the site. It was empty, but there were clear signs of a fire. There were also multiple shoe prints all around, and not far off a small hut or maybe a cabin, not something temporary. I approached with caution and looked inside. The open door place was old and musty smelling, but inside there was tons of camping gear: tents, hiking sticks, bags, everything a camper or hiker would need. Expensive gear too, not just some cheap junk. The way it was piled up though, it didn't seem like it was from one person or even from one time frame. Some of this stuff was new and some of it was older. I turned away and started quickly going back. By some miracle, I happened to stumble by a boulder that I remembered passing on my way up, and from there I found my way to the right path. I took it back to the way I came and got out ASAP. I notified the police just in case, but nothing came of it. I don't think they ever searched the area, but I think whoever was out there was stealing people's camping equipment by getting them to go off the main path. I don't know how they did it or if anyone who fell victim was able to make it out, but I think I was extremely Classido finding out firsthand. Oh, I do a lot of small camping adventures throughout the year. I try to keep these adventures under 3 days long so that I could do them on the weekend and only have to take a day or two off from work. This was just another camping trip of mine that I'd set to go on one weekend in the middle of April. My plan, so to speak, was to hike an estimated 5 hours up to a small lake and set my camp right next to it, then stay a few nights before going back. In the morning of, I drove out there and started the hike at 8 am. This lake didn't have any trails leading to it, which was part of the reason I chose to hike there. It was only a 5-hour walk, so getting lost wasn't too concerning, and I wouldn't have to share my experience alongside a bunch of random people who also wanted to go camping at the same spot. 4 hours into walking, though, I thought I saw someone. I was just spacing out when I saw something far ahead rushed past my view. I froze in place, trying to see what Orwo it was and where they had gone. But there wasn't no more movement. I wasn't looking directly at it when it happened, so I didn't have a clear enough view to know for sure that it was April sun, but I paid more attention for the final hour of the hike. When I reached the lake, I was taken back by its beauty. It was the perfect place to catch a break. I didn't spend long finding a spot to set up camp, being in the trees just off to the side of the lake. Almost as soon as I did, though, I saw someone. This time for sure they were on the other side of the lake, walking around by the trees. They had no backpack or anything, they were just walking. I looked around for their campsite but didn't see anything at all. After a minute they walked into the forest and didn't come back. This definitely put me in a slightly nervous mood, knowing someone else was out here at a remote lake and making me wonder if I really did see a person before. While I was walking, chose to spend the rest of the evening at my campsite. And come nightfall, I started up a fire. I kept it small to not draw too much attention. It had been almost 4 hours since I seen the person, but I was still nervous. I heated up some food and ate, then took a book out to pass the time. I got through a few pages, but I couldn't ignore this feeling like I was being watched. I knew it had to be my brain being paranoid because of earlier, but after a few minutes I couldn't even get myself to read anymore. Put the book down and packed my stuff in the tent, preparing to go to bed. Right before I put out the fire, I did one last look around. About 15 yards away there was someone standing. Although it was really dark, I knew they were watching me, still not moving or anything, and we both just stared at each other through the dark forest. We must have been like that for a whole minute. When the person started backing up, they still faced me but walked back into the trees until they were submerged in the darkness. I was physically shaking. What were they doing, and were they going to come back? I built the campfire larger and stayed up through the entire night. At the break of dawn I packed everything up and moved quickly, making my way back. There wasn't a bone in my body that wanted to stay there a second longer. During my hike back, I swear I heard footsteps far behind me on multiple occasions. Even now, thinking back on it, I can feel me body tense from the fear I experienced on that trip. I don't know what that person wanted, who they were, or what they were doing out there, but based on how they were stalking, might couldn't have been good. If I had stayed there another night or had gone to bed in the tent, I'm almost positive I wouldn't be here today. This was in 2015. I had taken a road trip to a forest a few hours from me. There was a hike up to an abandoned fire lookout that I was really excited to explore. Ishold mentioned it was technically illegal to go inside it or camp in it as it wasn't kept up with and could be structurally unstable. I'd done some research online though, and most people said that it seemed okay. But the last post I could find about it was 3 years ago, so I really didn't know what I'd find when I got up there. Anyway, I found a small ditch on the side of the road that I could park in. Then, I got out my backpack with 2 days worth of gear and started the hike. With trips like this, there aren't usually defined paths to get there. So, I used a handheld satellite GPS that allowed me to make sure I was going the right way, but really the whole time I was just cutting through unknown terrain in the woods. The hike from the road was about 4 to 5 hours. The further in I got, the more dense and rough the terrain got. I was really banking on the fire Lucato still be intact and good enough for me to camp out in. But I guess if not, then I was just going to have to find somewhere else nearby to set up my tent and sleep at. After the pretty tiring several hours of hiking through the woods, I finally got there. I could see the building peeking out above the trees, and when I got closer, it actually looked decently in shape. The paint was worn off, of course, but it seemed to be holding up well. I gave the support beams a few pushes and they were really solid. So, I tried my luck climbing up the ladder. It was metal and felt sturdy, but still creaked with every step up. When I got to the top, I was in awe for a moment at the views. I could see basically the entire forest. There were no buildings or roads or houses for miles in all directions. It was just the woods. After taking in the view, I went around the ledge and inside Thelokouts. It was really small, not like one of those big ones that you see get turned into airbums or whatever. This was just one room, maybe 150 square ft. It had a decaying bed in the corner and an old wooden desk in the other corner with rotting windows spanning the entire wall. There wasn't too much else to look at in there, so I put my bag down and rolled out my mattress and sleeping bag, then heated up a meal on my mini camping stove. Once the sun was setting, I walked out to the ledge and watched it. It was by far one of the best views I'd ever seen. I felt like it went by quick, though, and then it was just darkness. It was cloudy out, too, so no moonlight or stars were lighting up the sky. With nothing else to do though, I stayed sitting out on the ledge for a while. It was probably an hour into the night when I saw something below me. There was a light moving around in the trees. What was strange about it, though, was it wasn't like an artificial light. It had this orangish hue and was kind of flickering, kind of like a campfire would, which led me to believe it was a torch. He was moving between the trees in the forest, not too far from where I was. The chances of someone else being out here at the same time as me in such a remote part of the woods were really slim given there wasn't a Vina trail to get here. Also, traveling around at night without a normal flashlight and using a torch was pretty odd. I watched as the light moved under the trees for a while. Then it went behind something where I could no longer see it. For the next 30 minutes, I never saw it appear again. I still stayed on the ledge, though, taking in the calmness and quietness of the night. Eventually, the wind started to make it a bit cold, so I stood up to take in one last view before heading inside. When I looked below the ledge, though, someone was there. They were standing at the bottom in the grassy area between the fire lookout and the woods. It looked like they were looking directly up at me. Maybe it was the person with the light I saw earlier. "Hello," I called out. I didn't know what else to say. They didn't move or say anything back to me. It was just this strange 10 or 15 seconds of looking at each other before they lifted up their hand, like in an acknowledging way or apologizing. Then they turned around and walked into the woods, still with Nalighton. Obviously, that was incredibly creepy and eerie, but for some reason, in the moment, I felt so sure that it was just another hiker wanting to stay in the lookouts. It was probably just looking up trying to see if anyone was inside already. Why he hesitated to respond and only lifted his hand up, I didn't know. I stayed outside for a little longer, but not seeing anything else, I went inside and got my sleeping bag to arm up. It was a little bit hard to fall asleep because of the wind hitting the windows and the wooden beams creaking under me, But eventually I did manage to pass out. That it's hard to really know how much time passed. But when I woke up, the wind had settled down and it was still very dark outside. I opened my eyes, wondering why I was suddenly awake. But then I heard a familiar sound, the soft metal creak of the ladder outside. I sat up thinking I must be mistaken, but then I heard it again and again. Someone was climbing up the ladder. I couldn't tell how far up or down they were. I could just hear the hinges at the top of the ladder creak with every step up they took. Outside the windows, though, it was completely dark. I unzipped my sleeping bag and got up, heart racing as I grabbed my backpack and walked onto the ledge. During the 20 or so seconds that it took to get up, the creaking got louder and faster, like they were hurrying before it suddenly stopped just as I made it out to the ledge. I stood in place for a moment, waiting for another sound. Then I slowly walked around the walkway and peered around the corner at the opening to the ladder. No one was there. I carefully walked closer and felt my heart rate increasing as I leaned over and looked down. Nobody was on the ladder. I was just in shock for a second, confused and scared and unsure what the hell was going on. Then a sudden sequence of footsteps came rushing around the wooden walkway behind me. I only caught a glimpse of their dark figure running between the windows on the other side. I didn't hesitate to lower myself onto the ladder and hurry down. It was terrifying trying to climb down the slippery metal ladder as my whole body was shaking from the adrenaline rush with someone chasing right above me. I got halfway down before I saw their head peer out from above. I didn't stop until I got to the bottom and into the woods. Honestly, I didn't know why I even grabbed my backpack when I got up to see what was going on. But it was the best decision ever made. Maybe even saved my life. With my flashlight and GPS on me, I was able to hike my way out of there and back to my car. As far as I know, it wasn't followed. I drove away and never looked back. I'm 29 and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lived just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year, in the fall being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains in the days leading up to the trip. Though my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work, I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you'd typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there you could see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When I got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. Jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators. But again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds in the morning. I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark, so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again. The next day, I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I walked around it, enjoying the scenery, then pitched the tent and set up my camp on the tree line beside the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept turning around, hearing soft noises somewhere between the trees behind me. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was really creepy. It almost sounded exactly like footsteps, but I knew nobody would be out here. I would have seen their tent. When I walked around the lake, it was too dark at this point to see anything further than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option. Anymore. An hour later, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes I would hear footsteps again. They were barely too quiet for me to tell for sure what they were, though eventually I got so tired that I fell asleep, and what I think was only an hour after I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I jolted up and grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the tent and looking in the direction of the footsteps. I saw the bareback of them running away in the distance. My heart was beating rapidly. I looked down and saw footprints all around my tent, like they had been walking around me and searching the campsite. I tried to get the campfire going again as fast as I could so I could see better. I was terrified. I had nowhere to go and nobody to help me. I sat at the fire all night, keeping my head on a swivel, but I never saw or heard anything else. In the morning, I snapped a few pictures off the lake, then started the hike back. I had planned to stay for a whole day. It wasn't comfortable anymore, feeling like I was being followed. I was able to make it back without any more trouble, thankfully, but along my journey I began noticing several things missing from my backpack. Small things like food, a few tools, etc. But I always had my bag with me. Even today, I wonder if whoever had been outside my tent that one night had actually snuck inside and stole from my bag while I was asleep. Even the thought of it makes my whole body shiver. I went on a camping trip with my buddy from college. I'll call him Andrew to keep both of our identities private. Had been friends for a little less than a year and both enjoyed the forest and going for hikes, but really hadn't ever stayed overnight in nature before. This was during spring break at our school, and we'd been planning this for a while. We chose a trail we were familiar with and even got a basic idea of the area we would set up at, and come the day off, we headed out without thinking twice. We were happy seeing that nobody else was on the trail. In fact, we had chosen this trail for that very reason, knowing it was never a busy attraction. The trail took us about 6 miles into the forest before we got to the general area where we wanted to set up and pitched our tents, then had a small meal just before the sun was about to come down. Andrew and I collected some large stones and sticks to make a fire with and got it going. Just as it got dark, irresponsibly, we brought a pack of beers and started drinking while talking and just hanging out by the fire. We had some good conversations and had fun, but a couple hours and we were ready to call it a night. We put out the fire, then got no tents to go to bed. I actually fell asleep really easily because of the calm sounds of nature, but throughout the night I kept waking up. It wasn't due to any noises, but I would just jerk awake for some reason. I assumed it was just me being unfamiliar with being out in the forest at night, but it still gave me an uneasy feeling. Then on maybe my 4th or 5th time waking up, I heard Andrew's tent unzipping. I thought he was probably going out to use the bathroom or something, but he only took a few steps until I heard him open up his backpack and start searching around. Another 30 or so seconds went by with no other noises. It was like he was just standing right outside of his tent. I sat up and eventually unzipped my tent and looked out. As soon as the sound of my zipper began, I heard Andrew's footsteps rush away from the front of my tent, and by the time I stuck my head out, Andrew was ducked down and quickly shoved something back into his backpack, then turned and looked at me with a concerned face. Is everything okay? He looked at me for a moment, then nodded his head. Something about this immediately felt off. I climbed out of my tent and stood up, asking what he was doing out here. He responded by saying he was having trouble sleeping and just came out for some fresh air, but while he was talking, I looked down at his backpack. Sticking out of the top was the back end of a handgun. I felt my face turn white as I looked back at Andrew and tried my best to hide my reaction, but he already knew what I saw. We stared at each other for a strange few seconds before he turned and went back inside his tent, not saying another word. I'd never seen him act like that before, and his face gave away that he was guilty of something. It was already strange that he never told me he was bringing a gun, but the way he was acting just made it even more unsettling. I stayed up for the rest of the night, sitting on the ground outside the tents and waiting for the sun to come up. When it did, I packed everything up and left. After that day, Andrew never contacted me, which I guess proves that something was going on that night. I don't know for sure what would have happened or why it would have happened, but I know that I was lucky to get out of there before finding out. I was camping at a small lake for the weekend. Really, this wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a few days in the woods by the water to relax and nothing more. The first day was exactly that. I got there, set up camp, and chilled for the whole day and night. This was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It had Athen footpath leading to it, but it wasn't marked on any maps online or anything, so only locals would probably know about it. My dad used to take me here when I was a kid. In all my years going out to that spot, both as a kid with my dad and as an adult by myself, never once was anyone else here. Honestly, there was never even any signs of anyone else ever having been there. Anyway, on my second day, I spent my time walking around the water and I guess just thinking to myself, I must have circled the lake 3 or 4 times. During those hours of walking, everything was quiet and nice. But then in one of my laps around the lake, I happened to spot some footprints in the dirt just on the edge of the Trian. I had been walking the same circle over and over and never saw them before. Where they were, it was so clear and obvious. I don't think I would have missed them. They also looked pretty new. And what was really strange was not only that the footprints meant somebody else was out here, but that they were literal footprints, like barefoot, not shoe prints. The part off the lake I was at didn't even have any easy access to the water, so it's not like they took their boots off before going for a swim. Not to mention, I would have seen them in the lake. Seeing this really creeped me out for some reason. Why didn't I see them nearby while I was walking around? Were they watching me and didn't want me to see them? It was hard not to get paranoid about it. From what I was able to see, it looked like the footprints went up to the Trian looking out of the lake, then right back into the woods where it seemed to go straight back for a while. I didn't want to follow them into that unknown territory of the forest. So I just walked back to my campsite. I kept looking out to the lake, or I guess the tree line around the lake, seeing if anyone was out there. I never saw anyone. As the sun started to come down, the paranoia started to build up again. Something about the footprints just felt off. And knowing that they were likely still nearby, it wasn't a comforting feeling. When it got darker, I fueled up me campfire with a good supply of wood and sat around it. I did whatever I could to keep my mind off of it, but it was pretty difficult. Part of me felt justified in feeling uneasy, and another part of me felt like I was overreacting for no reason. But not too far into the night, I heard footsteps approaching from the trees. I instantly turned and faced the darkness they were coming from. There were more than one. It sounded like 2 people slowly walking closer to my campsite. I stared in their direction until they suddenly came into the light. It was a man and a woman walking next to each other and stopping just at the edge off where the light from the fire could reach. I couldn't see much of their faces or really anything more than their basic shape. I couldn't even tell how old or young they were. "Can I help you?" As soon as I said that, the woman turned and sprinted back into the woods, completely disappearing. But the man stayed where he was. He didn't move or even look back at the woman. It was about then that I looked down and realized he wasn't wearing any shoes. These were definitely the ones who were out by the lake. I asked again if I could help him, but then he too turned around and quietly walked back into the woods. I pretty much had an internal freak out after that. That was the most unsettling and strange encounter I'd ever had. Almost not even feeling real that I didn't want to be in those woods for another second. I immediately started to pack my things. I'm not the kind of person to stick around when things get sketchy. Thankfully, my setup was easy to put up and take down, so I had everything tied down in my bag and ready to go within a few minutes. I didn't know where they went, but I didn't want to still be here if they came back. It kicked out all the unlit logs from the fire so it would burn out soon after I left. Then I hurried into the woods. The walk was nearly 2 hours. For the first 10 minutes, I was really on edge, unsure if I was being followed. But the further away I got, the better I felt. It was about 40 minutes into the walk. The whole woods was silent. Not even any crickets or anything, when I suddenly heard running footsteps nearby. It was in the distance, maybe 100 from me, and it was definitely a person that I couldn't see anything though, so I had to just keep walking. Only a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time on the other side of me. The footsteps seemed quieter than they should have been, too, which led me to believe that they were running barefoot and that it was the same 2 I'd seen at the lake. If they'd been stalking Met his far into the woods, who knows what they were trying to do. For a while, I'd keep hearing running footsteps in the distance. Just short bursts like they were quietly stalking me and then suddenly sprinting away. I can't think of anything that would have been more terrifying than that walk through the woods. Somehow, though, I made it back to my truck. I was able to make it out off there. I wish I had more to say, or that I figured out who that man and woman were or what they were doing out there. But I have nothing. Maybe I'm insane, but sometimes I wonder if they were even alive or not. I don't know, and I'm not sure I wanted. I never went back.